Our next speaker is Jim Rasband, good friend and colleague. I think he told me he didn't have a song today. Jim is Dean and the Hugh W. Colton Professor of Law at the Brigham Young University Law School. Welcome to the University of Utah, Jim.
It is really a delight to be here, and pleased to be able to join Rabbi Korngold and Vicar Seddon on this panel. You're right, I don't have a song. I know you said we ought to start with one, and it's a good idea, but if you heard my voice, you wouldn't think so. In fact, true story, my parents were actually called in to my first grade class and were asked, can you please talk with your son Jimmy and tell him not to sing anymore because he's throwing all the other kids off. Not sure that's the way to handle things in the first grade, but it was true. It's really neat to be here at another Stegner Symposium, and just want to thank Lincoln for the invitation and Bob Kiter for what he's done over the years on law and the environment in Utah. And I was saying to him just the other day, because we were together in Denver, that he is the Stegner Professor of Law here, and I thought, all of us love to have titles, but if you can get a title and you're a natural resource law professor, there's no better one. And I don't know if any members of the family are here today, but just grateful to you for what you've done here at the University of Utah. These days, unfortunately, I spend a lot of my life not out on the lands, which is my favorite places to be, but in office doing deaning. And so it's just a delight to even be able to be allowed out to come talk about the land for a little bit. And so that's what I intend to do. I'm a little worried that today, my role is the skunk in the room. And sort of in two senses. One, I'm going to talk about the law some, and that hasn't yet been the focus. I was really grateful when Vicar Seddon got us into NEPA for a few minutes. And then when he unfortunately read in that voice the purpose and need portion of the EIS, I thought, that sounds like my talk. I hope not, but it is quite a bit of law. Actually, when Professor Davies asked me to speak today, that the topic that he gave me was to talk about the impact that religion should and does have on land and resource use. And I really want to attempt to do that, at least in a fashion, but first I thought I ought to address for a minute my own religious perspective. Now, as you can guess, because of my affiliation with BYU Law School, I'm a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. And that surely influences my perspective on the issues that I'll be discussing related to the environment and natural resources. But it's really a legitimate question how much impact it has on, how much impact my religious views have on my views about the environment. In fact, as I thought about my remarks today, I kept asking myself whether my views on natural resources, on the public lands, were really a function of my faith. I want them to be. I hope that they are. But I have to concede that sometimes they may be a product of a lot of other priors, perhaps a libertarian policy bent that I have, or other things that impact the way I see natural resource issues. And I have to concede also that some of my best impulses, which I'd like to attribute to religious motive, don't distinguish me from my friends of other faiths or from my friends from no faith at all. And so as I wrestled with the topic that Lincoln wanted me to address about how religion impacts land and resource management, I inevitably began to wrestle with my own religious perspective and what it had to say on those topics. So some of my talk will focus there, and I hope you'll forgive me for relying on my own experience. I think similar doctrines appear in other faith traditions, and I'll certainly discuss a little bit more of that toward the end of my remarks. And I should also, I guess, be clear that unlike Elder Nash, who spoke earlier today, I don't speak for the church. And so to the extent I discuss LDS doctrines, I'm just taking my best guess like any other member of the church. And so you've heard from Elder Nash, and I think he's set forth some really sound doctrine and principles for the church. Tomorrow you'll have a chance to hear from Dr. George Hanley, one of my colleagues down at BYU on the humanities faculty, and George has spent a lot of time thinking about these issues and is far more expert than I, so you'll get to hear from two other voices. But my own sense is that, let me just bring up this is Elephant Arch. I don't know if a lot of you have been there in the Grand Staircase, beautiful place. It really doesn't have anything to do with the talk, as do most of my slides don't really, but to the extent the talk drags, these are really beautiful photos. And so with apologies to Rabbi Korngold, I want to share with you just a couple of more excerpts that I think describe LDS doctrine and the responsibility of environmental stewardship and that part of, and that command within LDS theology. A couple of these you've heard a little bit about earlier today. Just a couple here on the left from LDS scripture. This Alma 30:44 is in the Book of Mormon. All things to note, there is a God. Yea, even the earth and all things, not all, call things, all things that are upon the face of it. You heard Elder Nash address that one. Doctrine and Covenants. It's another book of scripture that we hold sacred. And it pleaseth God that he hath given all these things, the good things of the earth, unto man. For unto this end were they made to be used, with judgment, not to excess, neither by extortion. And then you have, on the right side of the slide, a number of statements by LDS prophets. Now, literally, there are just dozens of these, and I picked three that I particularly liked, but it should give you a flavor for what I hope are basic principles that those of us who are LDS ought to have in mind as we confront environment and natural resource issues. So, Brigham Young, is there not bitterness in your feelings the moment you find a canyon put in the possession of an individual and power given unto him to control the timber, wood, rock, grass, and in short, all its facilities? Joseph F. Smith, a later prophet, the Latter-day Saints ought not to be governed by purely selfish motives in the use of their landed inheritances. The policy of living for today is not only destructive of material interests, but it begets a selfishness harmful to religion. Ezra Taft Benson, we are morally obligated to turn this land over to those who succeed us, not drained of its fertility, but improved in quality, in productivity, and in usefulness for future generations. I am sure our Heavenly Father expects us to use these precious natural resources wisely, unselfishly, and effectively, both our soil and water. And finally, more recently, President Gordon B. Hinckley, the earth is his creation. When we make it ugly, we offend him. I think this sets out pretty well and pretty clearly some of the basic precepts that should underlie our view as persons of the LDS faith toward the environment. And I think that you heard that today in part from Elder Nash. But if sort of avoiding abuse of and environmental stewardship are important imperatives within LDS doctrine, my worry is that a whole series of harder questions remain, particularly in the sort of specific applications. I think there was, in the question and answer session this morning, there was a woman here in the middle who asked, okay, well, that's all well and good. Those doctrines are nice, but what is the call to arms? What are the marching orders? How do we then apply these principles to the environment? And I think those are really difficult questions. I think the one area where I would take issue or disagree in part with the statement that was made is, I think it was a statement elsewhere, but that does it really matter if we just articulate principles if we're not applying them on the ground by way of application? And my view is those principles do matter. I mean, I thought that the statements this morning mattered. They mattered to me in my faith. My guess is they matter to some other you in your religious traditions, because those principles ought to drive action, and maybe we act on them in different ways. But the statement of principle and hearing it, I believe, is quite important. But in any event, the hard questions about stewardship are not whether we have that obligation, but how does it play out in our lives? What does it mean? Does to have a stewardship, how does that answer the question of whether we'd want to set aside land as wilderness, more protected, or as national park, less protected, or for multiple use management? how does our religious faith give us the answer to that question? These are hard things, and they're made particularly hard even in LDS theology. Let me just share a couple of other things with you that involve some balancing. Here are a couple of statements, again, from one is LDS scripture in the Doctrine and Covenants, the other is from the New Testament in Matthew. But again, the idea in LDS doctrine that we believe governments were instituted of God for the benefit of man. One of the things that governments do is to protect the right and control of property. Immediately you have this tension then between something that those of us who are involved with natural resource and the environment see all the time, between claims of property rights and claims of the needs for environmental protection, and you have these two doctrines. I don't really like to use the word in tension because you hope that at some level we can figure out how they can be complementary. But nevertheless, we've got a task on our hands. Or the injunction in Matthew, the preeminent injunction in my mind in all of Christianity, which is to care for the poor and needy, to clothe the naked, to feed the hungry. And you ask, and what does that mean with respect to the environment and with respect to our decisions about resource development? The entire tension in international environmental law of sustainable development. We need to develop to protect, to accomplish this task, but in a sustainable fashion, and what exactly does that mean? So my sense is, or the concern is, that sometimes, I suppose I can satisfy myself that if you identify scriptures on any particular side of an issue, or identify statements by church leaders that I believe are inspired, and then we sweep our hand and say something like, see, this is obviously the answer. But it's not really enough to cite scriptures and statements in support of environmental stewardship, nor is it really enough to cite statements in favor of private property, although my sense is historically in Utah, it's probably that citation that's occurred most often. My favorite thing I learned when I moved to Utah 17 years ago now, so somebody said, well, tell me about Utah land use law, and it's, oh, that's easy. If you have land, use it. And that can come from this injunction or just seeing one side of the issue, that it's all about private property rights. Or even how do you balance caring for the poor and environmental stewardship, and what does that mean in a particular context? These are really hard questions. And so what I want to try to do for just a few minutes is to suggest that some of our answers to that balancing question, both as a religious matter but also as a philosophical and policy matter, depend in some sense on the category of the particular environmental problem or the natural resource that's at issue. Now, I recognize as soon as one talks about categories that you're immediately at risk because no category ends up being entirely neat and clean. They often break down, they merge into each other. But I'm hoping that what the categories will do is give us a framework to think a bit about what our religious obligations might mean for stewardship. So let me just put this up. The categories I've put up on the very top of the slide, so you can see them up there. But those of us who teach in this area oftentimes divide the world into two parts, sort of environmental law and then natural resources law. And is there any difference? Why do you divide them up that way? Does that make any sense? But I'm going to divide those categories that way because I think it impacts how we think about these problems. Now, typically with environmental law, when we use that terminology, those of us who teach primarily natural resource classes, we tend to think of, we divide the world into sludge, that's environmental law, and romance, which is natural resources law. But what's environmental law primarily focused at? I mean, often you think about pollution control and human health. And so you think about the Clean Air Act, you think about the Clean Water Act, and you have questions about how many parts per million can come out of the end of a pipe or out of the top of a smokestack. And the focus is one that in law is sort of a tort law focus that is a harm prevention focus. Tort is just the law of personal injury. But we think about environmental law along that dimension. And natural resources law tends to be law of property. It tends to be law of allocation. If you think about the law respecting water or the law respecting grazing or the law respecting timber or minerals, you have this resource, and the question is, at least historically and traditionally, how are we going to allocate this resource between competing users? So on the one hand, you have the pollution control, protect human health, and the other is how do you divide up this resource between a set of competing interests? Now, of course, they don't fit perfectly that way. You can conceive of air and air pollution as this is a resource that we're consuming, right? Some are consuming it to breathe, others are consuming it to pollute, and so forth. And the question is, how are we going to allocate that resource between competing users? But nevertheless, that distinction is generally how we look at it. Now, there's a second distinction that I think becomes fairly important, and this is a busy slide, and I apologize for that. But let me take just a minute on it, and that is this. When you think about environmental law, generally what laws attempt to do, or I think what policy ought to attempt to do, is if you conceive of somebody polluting the air or polluting the water, what the law does is say, wait a minute, you aren't paying all of the costs associated with your activities. You are offloading those on others. And isn't it a wonderful thing, for example, if you are grazing a field, that your cattle can go down in the stream, stir it up, poop in it, and it all just flows off your property. When you look at your balance sheet, none of that's there. That's classic externality. Same thing with what you're putting out of a smokestack. And the idea is you're profiting and you're harming somebody else. And what the law attempts to do is to say, stop that. You must internalize those externalities. And so that's the slide on the left. And let me just talk about the slide on the right, and I'll come back to the religious impulse for them in just a minute. But if you think about natural resources and allocation, one of the questions that you have is sometimes trying to capture positive externalities. You have law and policy that tries to capture positive externalities associated with a particular property use. So on the right-hand side, I've got a wetland. And if you think, what is the value of and we'll just assume this is a piece of private property, you think, what's the value of that wetland? Well, it's fairly extraordinary value. I mean, it's flood control value, it's nursery value, it's habitat value, it's water purification value, all of those things. And as long as, if I'm the owner of the wetland, as long as I leave that wetland undisturbed and untouched, everybody else around me gets a wonderful positive externality, all those things associated with it, but I can't charge them. And then if I go to fill my wetland or change it, what's the response? Is it, wait a minute, you're harming us just like the polluter, or is it you're failing to provide us this benefit? I think it looks more like the latter, but it's definitely a contestable proposition. But if it does, I think it impacts the way in which we look at our religious commitment. I mean, to my mind, if you think about the sort of injunctions that you see, and these are both from the New Testament, but very common ones. Thou shalt love thy neighbor, and these sort of things we found, I think, with other faith traditions, but thou shalt love thy neighbor as thyself. Love worketh no ill to his neighbor. Therefore, love is the fulfilling of the law. Pretty clearly, that injunction, I think, answers the question of whether you can externalize all of the harm associated with your activity and just make it be borne by others, particularly and most often by those who are poor and needy and least well placed to combat it. And so you think, okay, the injunction to love, I think, answers the question about externalities. And so the religious injunction with respect to not polluting, pretty strong. And I think we see that in public policy as well, is that we don't, there's sometimes hand-wringing, but to stop a polluter from taking actions that harm others is a little bit easier than the kind of hand-wringing you get, for example, under Section 404 of the Clean Water Act when you say to someone on their private property, you may not fill this wetland. Because the sense is when you tell it to that individual, they go, now, wait a minute. I'm providing this positive externality. I should be able to do what I want here. You're not entitled to that. For all things, if you really want it, you ought to compensate me. And so in the law, the compensation questions with respect to a regulation or a law that prohibits pollution tend to be different than the compensation questions with respect to a law that prohibits you from doing something with your own property. Now, again, you can easily conceive of the wetland situation as you're creating a negative externality. I mean, if you eliminate the wetland and the floods come and they harm the person next door, it's worse than it was before. But the law sees the two differently. And my sense is that our religious obligation or our religious sensibility or intuition, maybe the better way to describe it, differs just a bit. And I won't read this quote, but I think that the intuition is more with respect to that owner. They have this individual obligation to protect, nurture, and use the resource, But it's a little less easy, although not, I mean, certainly it's in our law, but a little less easy to see where that activity ought to be stopped if what we're trying to do is to balance between, on one hand, the idea of liberty and property, on the other hand, the idea of environmental protection, both of which I think in my own faith tradition are important, but boy, that doesn't answer the question in any particular case. And to the extent you can enhance property and enhance the environment, those are the real winners. I'm going to skip this one. And what I want to, what I was trying to do with these sort of silly little PowerPoint things that I tried to put together late last night is just to suggest that if we're trying to balance, as you have to in any particular case, between the environment and then the injunctions on liberty and property, these competing principles that you see in, I believe, LDS doctrine, but elsewhere, these are fairly easy. I mean, to me, at least, the environment comes out ahead, and I could talk more about why. The others are a little bit harder. And I mean, then I think you're talking about what is the amount of harm, what are the particular rights at issue, and so forth. The balance is a little more difficult. Now, let me suggest one other area where this comes up and plays out a bit differently, and that is with respect to the public lands. Public lands, it seems to me, involve a different balance. We don't typically worry as much in that context about the balance between liberty and property on the one hand and environmental protection or stewardship on the other, because with respect to public lands, we are the stewards collectively through our democratic bodies making decisions about what we ought to do with them. And so it's really on us, just like it's on an individual private property owner with respect to how we will treat those lands as opposed to how we'll require somebody else to treat them. Now, of course, it's the case that on the public lands there are also property rights and valid existing rights to mining claims, oil and gas leases, and so forth that we have to address, and that again sort of prompt some sort of balancing. But as a general matter, we're making decisions with respect to the public lands as stewards. And so I think on the public lands, the issue is sort of less property balancing, but more balancing between the environment and development, or sustainable development, and trying to decide how ought we to use them to improve the social condition, and what do those decisions mean for those who are disenfranchised, both those who want to be in those public lands, but those who also want the economic benefits that Vicar Seddon sort of described so well. So let me just touch on a couple of other things. I put up this typology of environmental issues on the one hand, natural resource issues on the other. I just want to talk again about how they're a little bit different. If you think about environmental law, environmental issues, questions, because they are driven by human health concerns, usually we're in pursuit of the right answer. And there's scientific uncertainty, it's difficult to get to, but how much of this particulate can we allow to come out of the smokestacks and still protect human health? Now, it's again stating it sort of in a very rough fashion. What you find in the natural resource side is that a lot of our laws are actually directed at process and procedure, because when you have an allocation question of sharing between multiple parties, you don't have an obvious answer as to precisely how that resource ought to be allocated, and so what you want is a rule that brings people together so they come from different backgrounds, express their views of how that resource ought to be allocated and used. And so NEPA is one of those that does that. You have the National Forest Management Act or the Federal Land Policy Management Act, FLPMA, NIFMA, that require planning for our forests or planning for our public lands. The Magnuson Fisheries Conservation Act, same sort of thing. Come together, talk, process becomes very important because the answers on allocation are not always as obvious, at least to me, as the answers with respect to pollution or the obligation, moral and legal, to internalize the externalities that you're creating. I put this up because I think sometimes that's the view of all of these process concerns with respect to environmental law, is that it's only if you don't get what you want that you start whining about process, and that process itself doesn't matter much. And so John Margolis from High Country News, which is a wonderful magazine if you're not familiar with it, but says, only losers care about process. I hope that's not the case. And I think in the end there's there's a need for humility in how we approach environmental and natural resource issues. There's extraordinary scientific uncertainty that should make us humble in the face of that uncertainty. There should be uncertainty and humility in the face of competing values. I've been trying to allocate between many people who see how we ought to use our public lands or how we ought to use our resources differently. And my sense is that, if we think about what can religion mean for the environment, or how should our faith impact public land or natural resource management, my sense is that at the very least, it should tell us something about how we go about it, and something about process being important, that how we advocate for the environment and our preferred resource preference. In that sense, it's important to be kind, to be gentle, to be patient, to follow those injunctions. Does the injunction to love our fellow man answer the question of whether cattle ought to be allowed in a particular canyon down along the Escalante River? Hard to say, because you're balancing different things. I mean, my preference is that they be out, but you're balancing long-term, perhaps not a property right under the Taylor Act, but certainly a long reliance interest. You're balancing a livelihood. Tough questions. But I don't think it's such a tough question about what a religious faith ought to tell us about the way in which we conduct that conversation. With kindness, with patience, with forbearance. Let me just conclude, because I'm out of time. I suppose I want to say one concern for the environment and obligation of stewardship is a concern of religious faith. It certainly ought to be a concern for those of us of the LDS faith. And yes, it's a competing principle that needs to be weighed and balanced against a variety of others. But to remember that it is a principle that needs to be weighed and balanced is an important thing. How one debates is a critical thing. And I put these various references to the Golden Rule up only to make the point that our adversaries in environmental debates and natural resource debates deserve the treatment that we would hope they would give to us. That's not an injunction that is individual to those of us who are LDS. I mean, I think it's pervasive for all faiths and for people of virtue, whether they're faithful, whether they adhere to a particular faith tradition or not. So kindness, empathetic listening is a critical part of our environmental obligation. And I think, for the students at this law school, at my law school, one of the things that we really hope that they gain as they come through law school and as they spend their time in classrooms debating with people from very different backgrounds is to learn to be an empathetic listener, to learn to hear, really hear, the concerns of the parties that they're opposing. And my sense is that sort of empathetic listening will get us perhaps farthest on all of the environmental concerns that all of us hold dear. I'll stop there.